I'm Jason Pontin, the editor-in-chief and the publisher of MIT Technology Review. This morning I have gathered together with David's and MIT Sloan's help a distinguished group of panelists who will describe the meaning, the opportunity, and the challenges of the Untethered organization. So, but let me briefly introduce my panelists, and then I'm going to ask each one of them to spend 2 or 3 minutes describing the focus of their current work and why they have any authority at all to speak on the subject. So, to my immediate left is Anant Agarwal, currently the director of CSAIL here at MIT, but recently named as the director of MIT's most interesting new initiative, edX, which he will tell you directly about. Sitting next to him is Erik Brynjolfsson, who is the director of the Center for Digital Business here at MIT Sloan. And on my far left, Joichi, the director of MIT's Media Lab. So, Anant.
Well, I guess my own personal situation is an example of living in the untethered lane. So as Jason mentioned, I'm currently the director of CSAIL, the Computer Science and AI Lab. But there's a tsunami coming at us, which is a huge opportunity in terms of online learning technologies, huge advances in computing technologies and the internet. And all of these technologies have transformed the way we do business. There's been massive gains in human productivity, transportation, energy. But the funny part is that none of these technologies that we have been at the forefront of creating have really come back home and helped us impact our own core business, which is education and learning. There hasn't been any major innovation in learning, I guess, since the printing press. I guess the most recent innovation, the best I can think of, is colored chalk and PowerPoint. But so part of what we're doing is looking to innovate ourselves, and as we'll talk about the untethered enterprise, you want big organizations to try to innovate themselves so that they are the leaders of change rather than have change overtake them. So MIT and Harvard recently announced edX, which is a new initiative on online learning. And I'm going to be leading that effort, looking to see how education untethers itself.
Could you briefly describe the core insight or the core value proposition of edX, which whenever I describe it to people, freaks people out, and they say, you can't possibly do that?
So edX is it's got too many contradictions. First of all, it is a not-for-profit startup, if there is such a thing. So edX is a joint effort of Harvard and MIT. Our aim is to create online learning platforms and a portal, enabling MIT and Harvard and a host of other universities to offer their courses online, both on campus and worldwide. Our aim is to educate 1 billion people around the world. The education is going to be free, and we are going to find a way to monetize it. A lot of companies have done that. Once you have 1 billion customers or alumni, I guess self-sustenance is not that big an issue. You will find ways of doing that.
It's a civilizational scale project using machine learning essentially to somehow mark and manage this gigantic educational enterprise. It's extraordinary to think about. Erik, talk about some of your research, please.
Sure. Well, I'm the director of the MIT Center for Digital Business, and what we do at this MIT Center for Digital Business is try to understand how some of the amazing technologies that my colleagues to my left and right and all over the world are bringing to business and the economy, and look at the transformation that's driving, the fundamental changes in manufacturing, healthcare, media, retailing, transportation, just about every industry, except for perhaps education, but that's next on the list. Yeah. And I'm glad that my employer is going to be joining in that disruption. We're based at the Sloan School, so we look at some of the new business models that are emerging and what the implications are for productivity and performance. Although this has been a very tough decade for a lot of people, it's not widely known that it's actually been a more productive decade the past 10 years in terms of innovation and productivity growth in the United States than the 1990s, which was obviously very good, which was better than the 80s or the 70s. So we're seeing actually accelerating productivity and change. At the same time, we're seeing dismal employment growth, and we're seeing stagnating median incomes. So trying to understand those contradictions and how we think a lot of them tie back to changes in digital technologies in particular. Andrew McAfee and I have recently written a book called Race Against the Machine, talking about how these trends tie together, and looking at how companies can stay on top of these changes is the focus of the work at the Center for Digital Business.
Thank you, Erik. And Joey, the Media Lab probably doesn't need that much introduction, but you could say a few words about the changes that you're leading at the lab.
Yeah, so I'm relatively new. I started officially in September. I never thought I would be in an academic institution. This is all still very new and strange for me. My background is I was in traditional media, was in somewhat enterprisey stuff you wouldn't believe. I was just thinking as I was in this room, I used to sell System 390 software for IBM and was actually on an ad for AS400s. So there was a period when I was kind of enterprisey, but then I realized that as the cost of innovation started to go nearly to zero with Moore's Law and the internet, that the innovation was leaving a lot of the traditional R&D labs like the Yamato's research lab in Tokyo for IBM and ending up in startups. And so I was very much an internet entrepreneur, started the first commercial internet service provider in Japan. And really, I think the internet was the triumph of distributed, untethered innovation over centralized, controlled innovation. And so my sort of thing with Untethered is really, my life shifted completely when the world became internet, which was anybody could access and innovate without asking permission. And the Media Lab, the reason I was able to somehow fit in there is the Media Lab is all about doing things without asking permission. I think a key difference between the Media Lab and a lot of other institutions is a huge chunk of our funding is undirected. And it's all about sort of peripheral vision, because by definition, directed research in some ways means that you have to sort of know what you're looking for in order to get the money. And the Media Lab is trying to discover those disruptive things on the periphery that you don't really know until you get there. And it's really kind of seat of your pants, and it takes a lot of courage. But because the cost is so low, the risk is low. And so a lot of what I think about is how do I talk to companies about opening up their peripheral vision, taking risks, small risks, without too much thinking, because the problem is if you do theory before practice, sometimes the theory costs more than the practice. And as we know from internet startups like Facebook and Twitter and Yahoo, they built the product before they thought about it. And just as Anant said, you can figure out the business model later for Twitter. I'm an investor in Twitter. They still don't really have a business model, but I'm not that worried about it. And so I think that in a large company, it's difficult because you have proposals and feasibility studies and things like that. And so one of the things I think that I'm very interested in, because most of our funding comes from corporate funders for the Media Lab, is how do I interface this kind of peripheral vision, undirected research thinking with the somewhat structured thinking that large enterprises have.
So I'm going to ask a few questions myself, but my experience at the MIT CIO Symposium is that you guys are wicked smart and have tons of good questions yourself, so I'm going to go to you fairly quickly. I would like to begin a little tediously by asking the panelists to define what they think untethered means and to give me some examples of untethered organizations using untethered technologies to their profit. Erik, yeah.
Well, I like to think about untethered more broadly. I mean, certainly part of it is the fact that technology allows geography to become less relevant and people to offshore and outsource their operations. But that's something that's been happening for a couple of decades now. And Apple famously is successful in having their manufacturing mostly done overseas and keeping all the profits with the designers and marketers here. The more interesting thing that's happened the past few years, I think, is the way that it's not even just hiring employees or offshoring and outsourcing your activities that way, but getting customers and users more involved. I'm doing a project right now with Juhi Oh, a postdoc at the Sloan School, where we're looking at the tremendous amount of value that some companies have been able to get from their users and their customers. Facebook, Joy just mentioned as a recent example. Of course, if it's on everyone's mind, the IPO, stock is down another 7% this morning, I hear. But that's a distraction. The fact is it's still worth north of 50, 60, 70 billion dollars. With 3,200 employees. But in another sense, they've got 800 million employees, unpaid employees, all of us who are creating content for them, putting a lot of hours into putting stuff up that other people are then consuming. Instagram, had 13 employees when it sold for $1 billion. That's also a very young, that was less than 15 months old. YouTube had 12 employees. There are many, more and more of these examples. Pebble Watch, where they used Kickstarter to help people help fund them. What we're seeing is that companies are being untethered from the traditional structures of working with their employees and paying them to create value towards creating an ecosystem towards a much more frictionless kind of economy where people can contribute in different ways, and curating that is one of the biggest sources of values going forward. And that's a fundamentally different kind of economy than what we saw even 10 years ago.
Anant?
So, I'd like to use an example. All of us have gone to school at one time or another, and the ultimate tethered enterprise is education. So you go to class, you are tethered down to your seat for 50 minutes, and you listen to a lecture. You have very rigid time constraints. You have to go to class at whatever time. I could never do that. My day, even now, I would like it to begin at 11 a.m. or 12 or noon. But certainly as a student, I had the choice of not going to class. So that's the ultimate tethered enterprise. If you look at what technology has given us, it enables us to do a whole bunch of things at any place, at any time, at our own pace. That is the ultimate untethering. So just the same example, to continue the same example of the lecture hall, as an example with edX, we have put online one of our MIT courses, Circuits and Electronics. We launched that course in February, worldwide, using computing and internet technologies, completely online, with zero marketing dollars. The numbers are staggering. We had 120,000 students register for the course worldwide. Zero marketing dollars, completely viral. And to put that number in perspective, Susan Hockfield said at a speech the other day that that number is larger than the total number of undergraduate degrees, 87,000, afforded by MIT over its 150-year history. So this is what untethering these kinds of technologies can do. And here, the students are all around the world. They are learning online. They're taking, doing videos and exercises. All the exercises are computer graded. There's no hand grading. The staff that I have to teach that course is about the same staff that we used to teach a 100-person course at MIT. 3 instructors and 4 TAs for a 120,000 student class. And we're using all kinds of technologies to not only enable students to do this from anywhere at any time worldwide, but using computing technologies, discussion forums. A key idea with this kind of untethering is, we all had sleepless nights. How on earth do we deal with the 120,000 students that had a question about a problem set? I didn't sleep for 3 nights. Just imagine, if you are Zipcar and you have 120,000 customers wanting to, you have a problem with the car, or, what on earth do you do suddenly? So I didn't sleep for 3 nights, but the solution was beautiful. It solved itself. So I'm sitting on the discussion forum at night at 2 o'clock, waiting to answer questions. And it turns out that students would ask a question, and other students would chip in, and before I could answer, they helped themselves.
Exactly.
They learned by teaching. And we hardly spend time on the forum anymore. In fact, I've told my TAs, I don't want you to go and answer a question unless you waited 3 hours and let the students figure it out themselves. So I think the ultimate untethering is using internet and computing technologies, allow people to do things at their own pace at any time, and let them work with each other.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, and now MIT is doing it as well.
So, jury, both Anant and Erik have described untethering as a kind of liberation. Do you give me some other examples, please, of profitably untethered organizations?
It would be sort of similar, but I think that roadmaps and plans and strategy are kind of a tether, and untethered. I guess, well, I can say this, I guess. I've heard senior people at Facebook flat out say, we don't do strategy. By the time you have a strategy, the world has changed. And it's one of the and what they have is they have agility. That huge company releases new features every week. And agility will eat strategy every morning. And that's what wins. And when you look at the hardware industry, for instance, so HP with their 4- and 5-year roadmaps, they have to get out of hardware because they can't keep up. And then Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Facebook are getting into hardware because they've got agility. And so agility and resilience are so much more important than roadmaps, strategies, plans, and strength. And actually strength is assets are a weakness. So you get tethered to lines of code because you can't pivot, because they'll kill you if you pivot. 2 years of programming, you're not going to dump your code in 1 week. When YouTube launched, it was a dating site with video. And they said, you know, it's not working. And then it became Flickr with video. No, that's not working. And then they said, oh, we're going to latch onto MySpace because MySpace is growing, and they took off. That's only because they didn't have lots of patents, lots of lines of code, lots of staff. They were able to, so all of those things that you think of on your balance sheet, your software, your lines of code, your hardware, if you're a printing company, your printing press, right. Those are humongous chunks of liabilities in the context of agility beating strategy. So the tethering to your assets is really, really, I think, the major liability that large institutions have.
It's interesting to think about why that's the case. I mean, the fact is that strategy you just described, which is enormously successful, would not have been successful 20 or 30 years ago. What's changed is digital technologies have made the world much more frictionless and made it much easier to make those kinds of transitions. And CIOs who have an architecture for their companies that is sufficiently flexible are going to be able to take advantage of this newfound freedom and liberation. But if you're still thinking in the methods that were very successful for most of the 20th century, you're kind of locked into the wrong set of technologies and therefore the wrong set of strategies and organizations.
So I think you've convinced the audience, or at least to me, that there is a liberation by being untethered. But I can also feel professional CIOs out in the audience saying, how do I filter and synthesize the information that's suddenly flooding the enterprise in a profitable and manageable way? So, Joey?
So in venture capital, all the first-tier funds don't look at the return on every investment. When I do, I have over 200 investments, but I only talk about Twitter, Kickstarter, Flickr. It doesn't matter because Facebook is going to make so much money that the last 10 years of investing doesn't matter for those funds that were in Facebook. And it's always the case. Every single fund that's successful first year has a home run in their portfolio that's more than everything else combined. And so first year fund, what happens is the LPs don't nickel and dime every single return. And actually, I had an entrepreneur call me last week, say, I'm running out of money, help me out. And I said, shut it down, do a new thing. I don't have time to help you recover this $100,000 investment I have. I'm sitting down trying to figure out how to make Kickstarter $1 billion company and Twitter $1 billion company. That's where my energy goes, because it's on upside. And so,
how did the entrepreneur take that advice?
No, it's great. He's like, really? And I said, yeah. You did a good job. The market shifted in the wrong way. If you do another thing, bring me the deal. I'd rather invest another $100,000 in you than to try to figure out how to recover the $100,000. Because the maximum you will ever lose on an investment is the money you put in. Whereas in a big company, you start straggling, like shaking around trying to recover a business. You'll end up spending more money trying to recover a dying business than the money you put in. It's the old bad money after good. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's only in retrospect that you know who the winners are. You have to make lots of bets. I didn't know Kickstarter would have been a winner. Twitter was nice guys. I wasn't sure where that was going. Wikipedia, if some kid had come up to you and said, give me a desk because I'm going to make the biggest encyclopedia in the world and the trick is anyone can edit it, you would have kicked him out of the building. But in retrospect, everybody wants to be part of Wikipedia. So the trick really is, how do you unleash the stuff and not waste time worrying about it until you actually, because I always tell anybody who pitches me an idea, I say, build the thing, get some traction, and then come back and talk to him, because you don't have to raise money to try things anymore, even in the company.
So don't filter and synthesize?
No, well, you just, literally, they're like Union Square Ventures, they only invest in stuff that has traction. You can wait for this stuff to have traction before you have to make a decision to do it. So many people are so used to the fact that the cost of innovation is high that they want to approve stuff before you try it. And I always say, practice before theory. Just try the damn thing. For $30,000, you can make a minimum viable product of any social media idea you have. And that's discretionary funds. That's more money than it costs any of you to be here today, right? So just let these people try everything, and then the ones that are going to turn into home runs, double down.
So, we can't have a panel that
Agrees
is,
on everything.
is agreeing on anything. And although my heart is with what Joey says, I let my mind overrule me this time. I think that strategy of, just let 1,000 flowers bloom all the time and pick a rose now and again. It's very chaotic. That will work. You'll pick a winner now and again. But let's say you have picked a rose. It's a nice little bush. This is cool, okay? But you have to go nurture it. Okay, what do you do next? Right? You cannot simply say, okay, I'll go and find something else. So the question is, how do you deal with a situation where you have a winner, or you have a possible angle on something? So there's several ideas. One is, I think agility is key. And so there, if you looked at past enterprises, we all were used to getting a bunch of computers, taking them in a rack somewhere or in a warehouse, and that was our capacity. If business built up too high, we were dead. If business tanked, we were dead. Okay, business had to be just right to manage. The trick now is with cloud computing. It's a huge new innovation. With cloud computing, you can be agile. The key with cloud computing is elasticity, okay, agility. So now there are startup companies and even enterprises, are able to increase the bandwidth or capacity 10-fold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold overnight. I'll give you my own example with edX. When we launched the first online worldwide course, I said if you get 100 people registered, it would be embarrassing. 5,000 would be a good number. And we didn't dream about 100,000. So we said, okay, let's plan for 5,000. We went with the Amazon cloud. We got a few machines there. And we did an analysis and so on. And I said, okay, let's quadruple our capacity in case we get 4 times as many people. And guess what? We got 50 times more people than we had imagined. Boom, with cloud computing, within 10 minutes, we're able to scale up the whole number of machines. And then we found that we were more efficient than we thought. We scaled them back down. The beauty is agility. And so cloud computing is one way in which you can be very agile as organization demands change rapidly. The second thing is, as you get large amounts of data, how do you make sense of large amounts of data? And we've all talked about the big data problem. And CSAIL, of which I'm the director, is just next week will launch a major new initiative called Big Data at CSAIL. It's MIT, CSAIL, an industry partnership looking to tackle the big data problem. And there are many ideas on how do you deal with information and actionable items from massive amounts of data. One simple example is sampling. How do you cleverly sample the data and try to make sense of big data? And there's many other techniques. And so I encourage you to look at Big Data at CSAIL, where we're looking to work with industry to try to figure out how to make sense of and create actions out of big data.
I can see, so I too wish to believe in my heart about this, the benefits of allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom. But at the same time, I know that the people in the audience have to manage the information systems of large organizations, and they have to develop resilience against failure. So how does an untethered organization manage the risk of failure in a way that a venture capital firm does not?
Well, I think Anant said this, but let me just say it a little bit differently. I mean, so agile software development is not a new thing, but it's a really important thing that a lot of big companies still haven't gotten. If you release code, like Facebook does this, I mean, they'll release code sometimes 1 week, and then the worst you do if it doesn't work is you've lost a week of work. This is like just-in-time manufacturing that the Japanese used to do. So if you sit and plan and build something for 3 years, the amount of loss, the cost of failure increases the longer you invest in something before you try it. And so we always say in venture capital world, if you release something and you're not embarrassed by it, you released it too late. Because what you want is you want to get data, because you want the thing to evolve. And it's really, you have to, that's why a lot of the internet companies always put beta on everything, because it's like, that's a sign that you're an agile company. But I think you can bring agility in a variety of different ways, but it's really about trying to shorten this iteration cycle. And you can do that in all kinds of things. People seem to think that it's like an internet startup thing. No, like Shinsei Bank in Japan did it for, I mean, lots of large enterprises are breaking up their components into lots of tiny pieces, and then those pieces go very, very quickly. And it's about, you have to unbundle everything. So apologies to all the package vendors here, but you can't do this with large packages. You've got to really kind of integrate the agility into the whole way that you think about your processes and your systems. But you can build agility into large enterprise, I think.
Erik?
To directly answer your question about the how you deal with the potential for failure, is there's another half of it that is equally important. First off, I agree very much with the shift towards agility. There's always been a balance that you had to strike, but technology has made it a lot easier to quickly develop, prototype, not just software, but business models. But the other half of it that is at least as important is the technology has also made it possible to much more quickly monitor, to sense and respond. And part of the equation is that when you do have something that's not working, you have to react quickly and prune it and identify that. If you just let these beta, inappropriate, embarrassing products and services continue indefinitely, then that's a disaster. So you have to have an architecture that allows you to monitor things. And thankfully, you know, with big data, with basically the digitization and monitoring of everything, you can very quickly get that kind of feedback. And then you have to have a culture that allows you to do both the experimentation, but also the pruning. It's a fundamentally different kind of culture, a different philosophy, as opposed to, as Joey was saying, sitting in a room and planning a 5-year plan, coming up with a one best plan. There's too much data, there's too many opportunities, there's too much information. You want to have a lot of them work in parallel. Going back over 50 years ago, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, called it the gale of creative destruction. And that can be a very effective way to run an economy. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for an economy, and it's uncomfortable for a manager. But if you have both halves of it, the creation, but also the pruning, it can be very effective.
And let me just add one thing, because I wasn't saying that you should release it with bugs. I think you have to do it, you have to have test-driven development. You have to have about, I think, 1.5 lines of code in tests as you do. This is more Anant's field, but I'm just going to say it because this is what I tell all my entrepreneurs. And like at Shinsei Bank, it was really amazing because they assume everything will fail. They build tests and backups for every failure. So every single week, they would shut off all their Microsoft systems and roll over to Linux. Every month, they would do a power cycle of their data center. And every year, they would do a hard data reset, an electrical reset. And they would build everything assuming failure with all the tests.
Exactly.
But they would still release it because the user may not like it. So that's the part you're releasing
If you have the
early.
confidence to recover from those kinds of things, then you can have the confidence to test them.
Exactly.
But if you're so worried that if anything
Right.
goes wrong, we're sunk,
Right,
then you won't
right.
test it in
And
the
I
first
think
place.
that's the difference between resilience and strength. Resilience assumes failure. It's about yielding and bouncing back rather than trying to prevent failure. And I think that's a fundamentally different way of looking at
And
stuff.
there's one other component to it that I think is also important, and that's the ability to replicate and scale up. So once you've identified those winners and you've pruned the ones that are failing, then you do what Anant said, and you use the cloud and use other digital technologies to replicate. A huge difference between bits and atoms is how easy it is to replicate bits. And one of your predecessors, Nicholas Negroponte, made a career emphasizing these points. But it's not just software and music and news and media where we've seen this happen, but increasingly it's business processes. Companies are taking their business processes, embedding them in a digital infrastructure, and once you've got that, you can take it at CVS, for instance, they came up with a better prescription drug ordering system in one location. And once they got it working there, then they replicated it to 8,000 other locations. Gave them a huge competitive advantage because the business process was digitized.
So let me add to that. The ultimate in resiliency is biology. Okay, let's take inspiration from biology. Okay, how is biology different from a big enterprise? If you look at a big enterprise or big infrastructure, our approach is let's build something very big, very centralized, and then make it completely bulletproof and resilient. Okay, layers and layers of armor, it becomes slow, but our hope is that something doesn't penetrate, and it's like this big little bunker that is this edifice that simply cannot be broken. And those things work generally, but
Like the Maginot Line.
there you go. But the biology is very different. Biology works. We all work because we all evolved, and our races have stayed intact over the years. And the reason is that you have lots of distributed entities that are very agile. Okay, you spawn a whole bunch, and all of us are running around, trying to do some local optima and things like that. And so what if some of these new endeavors or new initiatives fail? As long as there are enough of them that succeed and are resilient, you can still make very substantial progress. And so the untethered enterprise is completely congruent with resilience, provided you make each of those components very agile.
Erik has a nice example from an industry that on the face of it couldn't be less like a Silicon Valley startup, which is the gambling industry. The CEO of Caesars, Gary Loveman, has an approach that is deeply experimental. Perhaps you could give that as an example?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, Gary was an MIT PhD, and I was in classes with him. Went and became a professor, and then he, I guess, went the opposite of Joichi's path, and then he went into private industry. He was giving advice to Harrah's, which is now Caesars Entertainment. But he brought a very data-driven approach to that company and changed it from a command and control attitude where the CEO had all the answers to one where he wanted people to use data to figure out the answers. But that involved a fundamental culture change. He had to change about half of the senior managers, he said. And he also had to get the employees to embrace this data-driven, questioning, experimental method. He told my class when he came and spoke there that there were, he explained to all the employees that there were two things that could get them fired from Harrah's, not Caesars. One was if they caught you stealing from the company. That's a several thousand-year-old management principle. The second one was if he caught them running an experiment without a proper control group. And that just goes to show how much that culture has changed. I mean, not just running experiments, but running them correctly and scientifically. It was something that he wanted everybody in the organization, managers at the local hotel properties, to understand how to do that, iterate, learn what was working and what wasn't working, and then put it into practice. A complete culture change. And the bottom line is that company went from being a third tier, sort of also ran casino, to just being the #1 dominating company in that industry.
So that even though they're not releasing code on a weekly basis like Facebook, they are releasing experiments on a weekly basis, and they're low-cost experiments, and using data they can do more of what works and less of what's disastrous.
This is very important because people, I think, they have a tendency, so many of the examples come from the web world, the digital world, the software, and let's be fair, that is with the leading edge, and that is where most of it's happening. But it's good to see that companies in traditional brick and mortar industries can do a lot of the same thing. It doesn't happen quite as fast. It doesn't happen in days and weeks. It may take months and years, but ultimately it still makes them more agile than their competitors, and the results are quite clear. We did a study where we compared companies that have embraced a more data-driven approach to those that are less data-driven, and the more data-driven ones were about 5 to 6% more productive and also more profitable. They were clearly gaining market share versus their competitors.
You can do it too. I have more questions, but I know you guys have better questions than I might. So if you will file up to the 2 microphones at the front, please say who you are and where you work so we can know where you're coming from.
Hey, Gordon Happ with CNET. A question kind of around the investment discussion you were having, kind of fail quickly, let 1,000 flowers bloom. There was an article, I forget who wrote it last week, but talking in the context of social media and Facebook, that this kind of idea works very well when you have this lightweight software, but there are things like pharma and Tesla and so forth where you do need large investments. So how do you kind of reconcile those 2 points?
Did you say Tesla?
Tesla, for example.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on how you interpret it. I mean, it's true that Tesla's not something where you try a product for a week and then fail it. But if anything, I do think that's an example of how a startup with a fundamentally different attitude towards building cars can be competitive with companies that have been around for about 100 years. And it's probably not a coincidence that it had to be geographically in a different location and brought a Silicon Valley kind of attitude to that industry. In pharma as well, there is a embracing of an ecosystem of companies that are trying different drugs. And then there's the second stage that I tried to point to as well, which is once you identify the successful drug, then you scale it up. And it's true, sometimes that is a different company. Usually that's a different company than the ones that initially develop it.
And if I may, in the case of Tesla, they actually spent a long time experimenting with the prototype cars, and their factory, which you can see in Technology Review in this month's current issue, they experimented on for a long time, and it's a model of modern manufacturing techniques. And
who owned that factory before they got it?
It's someone interesting, isn't it?
Toyota.
Toyota did, that's right.
So it says something about, it's a microcosm of this transition we're talking about.
One human being works in the Tesla factory. Please.
Hi there, I'm Tim Doria, the founder of Boston Decision. We do data mining consultancy. And it seems like the topics that keep coming up in this discussion today about the untethered business is agility, measuring data, quantifying. I know Erik mentioned that data-driven organizations have 5 to 6% greater productivity. This is something that I tackle and struggle with myself. You know, as a startup consultancy, I'm trying to measure my own company. I'm trying to rethink how do you structure a consultancy that is data-driven, almost like Wikipedia, where you have outside users contributing to the entire structure of the business. One observation that I've had, though, in trying to structure a business that's very data-driven is a lot of times the insights that come out of looking at collective intelligence may not be the elements that are best for the business. In other words, what the majority of customers want may not be what will get your business to really its peak performance. And I think there's plenty of examples such as Apple and a lot of really out there businesses where the consensus at the time, if you had heard what they were thinking, would not have aligned with popular opinion. And so my question is, how do you align and create a data-oriented business that's untethered while keeping in mind that some of the most innovative ideas may not be popular?
So so there's a really big difference between a metrics-driven organization and a data-driven organization. So metrics, I think, can be really, really limiting. If you are a library and you are measuring your success by how many books you're loaning, you're never going to get out of the book warehousing business, when libraries should really be centers of learning or something completely different. And so a lot of what big data should be doing is helping you do pattern recognition for those sorts of relationships and ideas that you wouldn't have found. So in a way, it's an extremely creative thing that you can use. So to me, the human field of vision when you're focused is only 1% of your field of view. Everything else is just filled in with stuff that you're making up in your brain. And when you are told, there's a study that shows if you put a dot on the screen and tell people to watch it, and you put little things in the peripheral, they'll see it. The minute you give a financial reward, I'll give you $10 to watch the dollar, it disappears. If you go mushroom hunting, if you look, you can't find the mushrooms, but if you look at nothing, you'll see the patterns of the mushrooms. It's pattern recognition is a really, really important thing to look at opportunities in the periphery and find those disruptive things before they get you. And what's really important is metrics are important, but getting the right metrics are important, but a lot of the data isn't what the data is trying to tell you, like directly. It's really about how do you think about it. So what we do a lot at the lab is we get tons of data, and we don't actually know what we're looking for. We're looking for really interesting patterns, and as you still drilling down in the patterns, you say, wow, what is this funny thing that I've just discovered? And then the theory comes out of it, I mean, at least for us.
And just to amplify on that point, I agree 100%. Data-driven certainly doesn't mean taking a vote of all your customers and picking the most popular one. I mean, that's probably an improvement over the way most companies do it. So I wouldn't say don't do that at all. And that's a first step. But it's not just for your statisticians to do the first moment, the mean. You could look at the second moment, which is the variance. Sometimes the more interesting answers come from the ones where there's a great divergence. We're looking at how citation patterns predict breakthrough papers. And it's not just papers that have a lot of citations. Sometimes it's papers that are very unusual. They're spanning different fields where there's a lot of disagreement that are actually more likely to be the home runs. They're also more likely to be strikeouts. But if you take Joey's philosophy, having half home runs and half strikeouts is better than having lots and lots of singles. So having the data is terrific. But don't think that you just mechanically take a vote and put it. You can look at these other dimensions of the data, and then you can even statistics is limiting. If you have people who look at it, their ability to see patterns in the data sometimes goes well beyond anything you can do mechanically. We still haven't replicated all of that. So don't confuse the two.
So if I just pick on a point you made earlier, which is that oftentimes if you look at a bunch of data and you take a consensus view, you ask 10 different people, or within an organization, if you take a consensus view, in my opinion, that is a damper of innovation. Consensus and looking at history and basing your future judgment based on that. In electrical engineering, we call it a low-pass filter. In low-pass filter, you constantly average values coming in with what you've seen in the past. We call it a low-pass filter. And so the trick is that if you take the averaging, you are going to get low pass, and at best, you're going to be a slow-moving, vehicle. But I think if you want to get, innovation and try to hit the home run kind of thing, I think the challenge for an organization is how to do that, how to look at data and say, look, I'm going to pick that. And different organizations do it differently. I'm a big believer in the benign dictator model, where, if you look at Apple, for instance, or maybe not so benign, but if you look at, if you look at Apple and so on, where, I think one person or maybe two went by gut, went by vision, and, and oftentimes that's what it takes. And, I don't think there's a science to how to do that, but oftentimes you have to bet on somebody, bet on something, and I think that is usually better. It gives you more variance in the system than if you do an averaging.
I urge the audience to read a wonderful interview with Steve Jobs in Inc. magazine from 1984 on the subject. It's the clearest description he ever gave of his own working method in this problem. And he said, the first bit's fairly famous. He said that users don't know what they want, and it's not their job to know. But the second part of the quotation has always appealed to me. The interviewer then said, well, how do you do it? And he says, very hard to explain. I listen to the technology, and I listen to the pull of the consumer, and I've somehow put the two together. And they push and they pull, and eventually I go to the engineer, and I keep on asking for the same thing. And eventually an engineer says, well, Steve, it's a pity you want X, which costs $1,000, because I can do Y, and that only costs 50 cents, and it's almost as good. And that's where Apple's genius came from. Please.
Hi, I'm Camila Chavez Cortez, and I'm an artist. So I have a piece on the tsunami across the street at the Roach Library. So my question is, given that this is an educational panel, you mentioned that we have 120,000 people using courseware, and these are motivated people. So what are we going to do for the billions of uneducated people that do not have access to these technologies, and there's not really data or any type of integration to really bring these billions of flowers up?
That's a question for you, Anant.
Sure. I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't cost a whole lot to get access to this kind of online learning. And our vision is to really disrupt the world and get this technology accessed by 1 billion people around the world. And the same thing can be used, by the way. Several folks have approached us about executive education and so on. How do companies could use the same technology to access, customers or their own training and things like that. It doesn't cost a whole lot at all. As an example, countries are doing this. In India, the Human Resource Department, we used to be the Education Department, has come out with a little a tablet. It's a little pad-like thing, $40, not rupees, and they're making it available to children around the country. So really, all you need is an internet connection and some device like that, and compare that to a $250,000 private education in the United States. I think if you look at the numbers, one can imagine doing a reasonably good job. Back to your example, if X is the ideal, we can do Y, a reasonably good job with a lot of people with a tenth of 1% of the cost.
Nicholas Negroponte, Jerry's predecessor at the Media Lab, has a new project which he will be announcing at the MTech conference here at MIT in October, which is currently in trials in Ethiopia, the poorest place you could imagine, where he is giving children he's liberating them, he's untethering them to teach themselves. And I urge you to come and hear about it. Please.
First, thanks for the great discussion today. Been enjoying it. I'm David Schleifer. I'm CEO of a company called FYI Tag. We're in the social media space, simplifying it, trying to provide a dashboard and publishing platform. I really have two things. One is I wanted to just touch on the double-edged sword, which is agility, which I think was thrown around liberally a little bit earlier, but then also talk about the power of the crowd, which you touched on, which is very close to social media and to what we're doing. First of all, with agility, it really is something you have to finesse to a certain extent. In a way, after I meet with a customer, we've got agility and the ability to turn around our requirements or even change a feature, not being locked into those lines of code and just saying, you know what, we're doing it the wrong way. And I think that's a great use of it. At the other end of it, a company you mentioned, Facebook, is out there changing their API regularly, not documenting it, and in fact, or giving us documentation, and then we discover that it doesn't quite work the way they said it did, and we've got to reverse engineer it, and then they change it again. And I'm sure from within there, well, once the hangovers, pass and they're all finished tallying up how rich they are, they're saying this is a great strategy. I'm testing their API for them and reporting those bugs. And they can move with a bit more agility, but it is that double-edged sword. So there's good and there's bad, and they've got to leverage the value of my being happy or unhappy. And right now, I think I'm fairly low on their totem pole.
The question?
The question is really around the power of the crowd. You talked about the students helping the other students, and you've got a forum for that. And I think for a lot of companies, that really happens in social media. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about how to do that, because also, as the other gentleman mentioned, you need to control the discussion a little bit sometimes, provide a little guidance and participate, but also control and secure the way you're doing it so that you don't lose control of the discussion or the assets you're using for them.
So how do you hear and curate the
Hear,
conversation?
curate, control also, and secure those assets that you're using to do it.
Well, absolutely. I think that's really key. This is not a matter of just, to keep using that metaphor, letting 1,000 flowers bloom and sitting back and waiting for everything to work out. Curation is really the key to this. You've got this tremendous user base, customer base that are helping each other, but you've got to set the dials just right. And if you're too controlling, or if you control the wrong things, right, you can destroy it. Or if you're not controlling enough. I was telling Jason before the panel, I was looking at some data about where people are spending time on the internet over time, and where people are spending most of their time on the internet 6 years ago was a company called MySpace, okay? So that was a tremendously successful social network, as probably many of you remember, but they didn't set the dials quite right. It got to be chaotic. If you went to some of their pages, they're very cluttered and kind of, it was kind of not a pleasant user experience. Right. And Apple, we were just talking about, although they want, their ecosystem, they want people to write apps for them, they also can be very strict in many ways about how the look and feel of everything. And you can get that wrong and you can get that right, but striking the balance is really why some companies are worth $60, $70 billion and other companies aren't successful. So it's not just a matter of, hey, let's let the users do the debugging for us and create the content. It's a matter of structuring that just right. I know people at all of these companies, talking to a high school friend of mine who's not at eBay, and his job is basically to manage the ecosystem, to write the rules of that economy. Just like the founding fathers, this little bit, I guess that's a little grandiose analogy, but they had to come up with the rules for the Constitution, for how the checks and balances. There are people at eBay and all these other companies that are constantly trying to set the checks and balances between buyers and sellers, between what's revealed and reputation and what's not revealed. And if you get that right, you can be very successful. And I can't give you a one-line rule of how to do that, because right, frankly, it's not a cookbook. It's a whole science and art.
If I might, add to that, so I'm going to start a little bit earlier, which is before I go to curation, which is that it's humans and their activity that is creating just a large amount of data. So one way to solve it is to use humans to solve it, and a key area that is emerging is something called crowd computing or crowdsourcing. Right. And so CSAIL, as an example, is doing a lot of research in this area, where you use a huge cadre of people around the world to go solve a problem. Just as an example, one approach is transcription. Let's say you have a lot of speech, you want to transcribe it. Okay, you can have a single person sit down and do it, but one approach that they have, and the company is forming on this as well, is they take the speech, break it up into pieces, and they ship it out to the world, and you have different people transcribe small pieces of the text. So we can get lots of work done. But the challenge is, how do you control quality? How do you curate the data? How do you make sure you're getting what you want? The trick is to use the same technique to solve your problem. So what you do is, I can just give you one approach. What you do is, now that you have lots of people, you have to build a system, which is very disruptive. What you do is, in this system, you bring in voting. Okay, so you have 3 times as many people do it. You give the same piece to 3 times as many people, and then when they provide solutions, your system allows voting. Okay, and then you can check to see if enough people agree on something, then the theory is that, okay, this must be right. Okay, and so you build systems for these kinds of social computing and other forms of computing, where voting and other techniques enable you to curate things in a way that at the end you get reasonable data.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevan Khawaja, and I'm the CEO of an IT services company that specializes in business process management and business intelligence. And I have a part comment and then a question as well. I think we talked quite a bit about data and agility. What we find in the industry, and I have about a decade of experience in large enterprises working for them, is the problem is even upstream. The problem is of visibility more than business intelligence. The problems are that the processes themselves in large enterprises are not fully visible to the people in the enterprise. I can give you multiple examples, but a very relevant one is very recent, the JP Morgan loss. Every day they are coming up with, they started with a $2 billion loss, and now they're saying it could be potentially up to $7 billion. While they can get the data from the exposure on the bets they made, it was the original process that was not very much visible in the enterprise. And therefore, I think data which is more of a snapshot in time, the processes are flowing in the enterprises like spirits, which are live inside corporations. And there is a lot of visibility which is lacking in the real-time data about those processes as they're live, as opposed to business intelligence, which comes later from mine data or data which is already past data.
So how can enterprises understand their own opaque processes?
Correct, and how, I'd just like a comment from.
I'm going to tie that to the earlier conversation, which is, I think when you try to control and organize, then everything gets very slow and very difficult. And I think the trick is to be aware and responsive and look for the anomalies as opportunities. And again, it gets back to my peripheral vision thing. But like, this is, I'm going to answer this question, then get to this one. But like, when hashtags came out in Twitter, everybody was very upset at Twitter because this is supposed to be for text. What are people trying to turn this into, like another stack on machine code? But once we sort of thought about it, everybody was kind of like, it's actually not a bug, it's a feature. And what's, I think, really important about control and structure is that suddenly all this stuff that it becomes very voluminous, and you can't do things in real time as much when you're having to plan everything. But when I think it's really important to be able to deal with messy data. And again, I hate to keep using the word pattern recognition, but what you need to do is also use the edges of your network, which is, if you have one IT department that's doing all of the data analysis, you're never going to be able to do it real time. But if you use the social network of your employees as for instance, use social networks inside and allow, because the way that blogs work is there are these little blogs that go after all the data all over the place. Some blogs are obsessed, for instance, with airplane repair. And there was one really interesting scene where the vice president's name before it was announced was the decal was put on the tail of the president's plane, and somebody reported it in an aviation bulletin board, and then some other blog picked it up, and then and Boing Boy got it right, and the New York Post got it wrong on calling who the vice president candidate was. But the reason is that you have this messy network of bloggers that amplify all the interesting information to the top of the blogs, whereas a structured data analysis like an intelligence system in many cases wouldn't get it. What I would suggest inside of a company is to ignore all of the day-to-day data, but look for the anomalies. And you look for the anomalies by empowering everybody in your company to provide data and anyone to amplify the data so that you get something that looks a lot like the network of blogs, bringing the interesting intelligence and the interesting patterns up to the top rather than centralizing it like a CIA.
My colleague, Quentin Hardy, has been very patient here in the front.
Quentin Hardy, New York Times. When you build really effective tools to try and change the world, they also change us. And I wanted you to sort of dwell on that for a minute, because you're talking about this world of, exceptional data coming in from all sorts of sensors and sources and very high compute. So you're in an environment where you kind of have to A/B test all the time. And you're in this environment of perpetual contingency. Every plan can change. Everything can shift. And the interesting challenge to society, perhaps, is a lot of our systems, particularly in government, are based on a kind of annuity taxation and Social Security deducted from paychecks every week. But we're heading towards a world of teams that dial up and dial down, and educational systems where you seek learning from others as much as from a central system. And so won't rewards become lumpy the way they are in a venture capital portfolio? And won't it be hard to establish annuity systems? And won't we have to restructure on a broader scale based on that?
Since that's probably the last question from the audience, that's a great question, guys. Thank you, Quentin.
Well, that's really probably the most important question society has to face right now, at least speaking as an economist, is we are having some fundamental disruption from the technology, and that's not going to just change, the mechanics of how work gets done. It's going to change, or it is changing, the way employment and productivity and creativity happen in the economy. And it's leading to not just much more lumpiness, it's leading to a superstar economy where there's a few people who are able to scale their creativity and their talents enormously and make billions of dollars. There are a lot of other people who may be just a little less talented who end up not being able to benefit and may end up having no job whatsoever. We have to start thinking about a reorganization of our economy that's happening whether or not we want it or not, to have new ways to provide these kinds of security. There are countries like Denmark and Germany that have found a way to balance a safety net with also a lot of flexibility. Our approach of linking a lot of those benefits and to employment is not a good fit for the emerging world, where there's going to be a lot more flexibility and a lot more volatility and a lot more winners and losers. So that's a big challenge that unfortunately most of our policymakers aren't taking very seriously.
Anant?
So, I liked how you started the question, which is that, we invent new things, we create technology, and somehow we have to change with technology ourselves. And the best example I like to use is that if we continue the way we are with our screens and keyboards getting smaller and smaller, if natural evolution were to take its course, I think we're all going to be, after a few hundred or thousand or million years, we're all going to be born with styluses, not fingers. So, I know I find real difficulty typing on my little cell phone, but jokes aside, to a bigger point about how rewards are going to be lumpier, and what does that mean for an economy where we're used to an annuity-based system? The flip answer is that, look, changes are happening, deal with it. But, but it's good to think about, can we direct change in a way that makes it better? And if you look at the automobile industry, how did that evolve? That evolved with the concept of ancillaries. So maybe that's what we do. So if we have a lumpy reward somewhere, we create systems where the person who was lumpily rewarded has sort of ancillary industry. Let's say a blogger becomes really famous. So maybe what that blogger does, gets a big lumpy reward. Maybe we find a way for that blogger to create a local economy, a local culture, where a little ecosystem evolves around that person, where there are many people that benefit from it. The example close to my own heart, education. So let's say with online education, we create this online structure that suddenly revolutionizes the world. We're thinking about a system where a lot of you may have a lot of entrepreneurs that create little, mom and pop tutorial shops. Like the tea shops, you have tutorial shops where they have online education coming in, and they create a widespread distributed economy where they're all, getting something out of it. So one could imagine new economies, new systems coming up where they kind of leverage these disruptions and create new businesses in a dispersed manner.
And can I just jump? I think the model of thinking about annuities and exponential growth, these are kind of Western linear thinking. And I think that both are not good. I think that natural systems are cyclical, they're dynamic, but they're also not exponential. And I think a lot of our science and technology in the past has been focused on trying to control, triumph over nature, to try to create an artificial system that somehow gets away from having to deal with nature. But it turns out when you get better at science and technology, you realize you're impacting the system in a very negative way. And so I think if you think about the future of science and technology, you have to start thinking about how do we create things that positively, or at least not negatively, impact the system, and think about systems rather than flat lines or linear lines like this. And I think too much of that, because those are little local ordinances that we're thinking about, it turns out it's a lot more complex. And nature's not fair, but at least it's balanced in an interesting way.
And you just wrote a blog post about this, where you said the great challenge of the next 100 years, essentially, was adapting our systems to this more cyclical approach to the future.
Because I think the whole idea of a career ladder or any kind of guarantee is not natural. And I think that those sort of unnatural algorithms are what get us in trouble as we start to integrate into a complex system where we don't have control anymore.
This is a great post by Joe. You should read it. David has indicated that I not only can, but must take one final question. So it has to be smart. No pressure.
I'll do my best. My name is Alan Alter. I'm a research fellow at the Accenture Institute for High Performance and a former technology journalist. Listening to all this, the way, I'm thinking for CIOs, the way technology work gets done, the big management tool are projects and project management. But listening to this, it sounds like project management and projects will have to change enormously in an untethered world. Right. Can you give us a glimpse of how projects and the art of project management and the art of project leadership will have to change going forward in this world?
So, to use another example from learning, where we're experimenting with a lot of things, what you try to do is you try to focus on creating interfaces. You don't try to create the whole system, and where we're expecting so let's take a learning platform as a system. Okay? Now you could imagine creating a project, creating a schedule, create a bunch of charts, and hire people, and then you march to a plan. It's very rigid and regimented, and you'll get to the end point, but it may not be what you want. And so an alternative approach is to say, all right, I'm going to create a sort of a basic scaffolding and a set of APIs and interfaces that will allow, and open source it. Okay, open source a basic platform, and you allow widespread innovation. With the basic APIs and the structure allows people anywhere in the world to contribute to this structure. It grows organically. You do have to have some curation to control what goes in, but fundamentally, I think interfaces are the key. So if you have well-defined interfaces, that's what you have to centralize. Otherwise, you get chaos. And once you do that, then you can try to have a lot more people, a distributed organization, contributing to some overall global optimization function.
It's interesting that Anant would say that, because he's looking at it from a technological point of view, but I've come to exactly the same conclusion from an economic point of view. The economy is changing from one that's based on inputs being used up to create outputs to one that's increasingly a knowledge economy and a creativity and invention economy. Not entirely, but more and more. Many of the companies we talked about this morning were in that category. And when you have what I'll call recombinant innovation, you don't use up your resources. Each time you invent something, it's not like you've used up the stock of innovations. In fact, you're adding to the stock of innovations that other innovations can build on top of them. And if you have interfaces that allow you to mix and match these different components in new ways, then we have more and more raw materials, we have more and more wealth, and we're able to create more and more value over time. But the key is to have an architecture that allows you to build this way in creative, and there are a virtually infinite, limitless number of combinations that you can put together as you add more and more component parts. That's what I see as the economy that we're going towards in the future. To take your words about project management, it's figuring out how to get people to combine pre-existing innovations and new ideas in ways that had never been done before.
And if I may give Joey Ito the last word of the morning.
So I'm just adding to the two of you, and just adding one thing. I think that the complexity and speed of projects has exceeded the cognitive limit of an individual brain, and that this is what the internet's about. The internet, David Weinberger famously called it small pieces loosely joined. And it's about, you can't now try to know the whole of it or try to control it. You have to create like processes and interfaces and structures where you have lots of groups that interact with each other with interfaces and standards, but you can't try to control it. It's about creating a culture, an interface, a process, an error correcting system, a resilience that allows you to have a system of things that work together, but you no longer want project managers who think that it's their job to try to know all of it because it can't be known.
Ladies and gentlemen, the CIO panel.